we go. Now we're recording.
Okay, well, I won't introduce this or anything. I'll just read it.
Okay. You won't hear much from my end until you're over with the reading.
Okay, great. The ghost was her father's parting gift, presented by a black-clad secretary in a departure lounge at Narita. For the first 2 hours of the flight to London, it lay forgotten in her purse, a smooth, dark oblong, one side impressed with the ubiquitous Moss Neotech logo, the other gently curved to fit the user's palm. She sat up very straight, Kumiko, in her seat in the first-class cabin, her features composed in a small, cold mask modeled after her dead mother's most characteristic expression. The surrounding seats were empty. Her father had purchased the space. She refused the meal the nervous steward offered. The vacant seats frightened him, evidence of her father's wealth and power. The man hesitated, then bowed and withdrew. Very briefly, she allowed the mask her mother's smile. Ghosts, she thought later, somewhere over Germany, staring at the upholstery of the seat beside her. How well her father treated his ghosts. There were ghosts beyond the window, too, ghosts in the stratosphere of Europe's winter, partial images that began to form if she let her eyes drift out of focus. Her mother in Ueno Park, face fragile in September sunlight. The cranes, Kumi, look at the cranes. And Kumiko looked across Shinobazu Pond and saw nothing, no cranes at all, only a few hopping black dots that surely were crows. The water was smooth as silk, the color of lead, and pale holograms flickered indistinctly above a distant line of archery stalls. But Kumiko would see the cranes later, many times, in dreams. They were origami, angular things folded from sheets of neon, bright, stiff birds sailing the moonscape of her mother's madness. Remembering her father, the black robe open across a tattooed storm of dragons, slumped behind the vast ebony field of his desk, his eyes flat and bright like the eyes of a painted doll. Your mother is dead, do you understand? And all around her the plains of shadow in his study, the angular darkness, his hand coming forward into the lamp's circle of light to point at her, the robe's cuff sliding back to reveal a golden Rolex and more dragons, their manes swirling into waves, pricked out strong and dark around his wrist, pointing at her. Do you understand? She hadn't answered, but had run instead, down to a secret place she knew, the warren of the smallest of the cleaning machines. They ticked around her all night, scanning her every few minutes with pink bursts of laser light, until her father came to find her and, smelling of whiskey and Dunhill cigarettes, carried her to her room on the apartment's third floor. Remembering the weeks that followed, numb days spent most often in the black-suited company of one secretary or another, cautious men with automatic smiles and tightly furled umbrellas. One of these, the youngest, at least cautious, had treated her on a crowded Ginza sidewalk in the shadow of the Hattori clock to an impromptu Kinzo demonstration, weaving expertly between startled shop girls and wide-eyed tourists, the black umbrella blurring harmlessly to the art's formal, ancient arcs. And Kumiko had smiled then, her own smile, breaking the funeral mask, and for this her guilt was driven instantly, more deeply and still more sharply, into that place in her heart where she knew her shame and her unworthiness. But most often the secretaries took her shopping through one vast Ginza department store after another, and in and out of dozens of Shinjuku boutiques recommended by a blue plastic Michelin guide that spoke a stuffy tourist's Japanese. She purchased only very ugly things, ugly and very expensive things, and the secretaries marched stolidly beside her, the glossy bags in their hard hands. Each afternoon, returning to her father's apartment, the bags were deposited neatly in her bedroom, where they remained unopened and untouched until the maids removed them. And in the 7th week, on the eve of her 13th birthday, it was arranged that Kumiko would go to London. "You will be a guest in the house of my associate," her father told her. "But I do not wish to go," she said, and showed him her mother's smile. "You must," he said, and turned away. "There are difficulties," he said to the shadowed study. "You will be in no danger in London." "And when shall I return?" But her father didn't answer. She bowed and left his study, still wearing her mother's smile. The ghost woke to Kumiko's touch as they began their descent into Heathrow. The 51st generation of Moss Neotech biochips conjured up an indistinct figure on the seat beside her. A boy out of some faded hunting print, legs crossed casually in tan breeches and riding boots. "Hello," the ghost said. Kumiko blinked, opened her hand. The boy flickered and was gone. She looked down at the smooth little unit in her palm and slowly closed her fingers. "Hello again," he said. "Name's Colin. Yours?" She stared. His eyes were bright green smoke, his high forehead pale and smooth under an unruly dark forelock. She could see the seats across the aisle through the glint of his teeth. "It's a bit too spectral for you," he said with an easy grin. "We can up the res." And he was there for an instant, uncomfortably sharp and real, the nap on the lapels of his dark coat vibrating with hallucinatory clarity. "Runs the battery down, though," he said, and faded to his prior state. "Didn't get your name." The grin again. "You aren't real," she said sternly. He shrugged. "Needn't speak out loud, miss. Fellow passengers might think you're a bit odd if you take my meaning. Subvocal's the way. I pick it all up through the skin." He uncrossed his legs and stretched, hands clasped behind his head. "Seatbelt, miss. I needn't buckle up myself, of course, being, as you've pointed out, unreal." Kumiko frowned and tossed the unit into the ghost's lap. He vanished. She fastened her seatbelt, glanced at the thing, and hesitated, then picked it up again. "First time in London, then?" he asked, swirling in from the periphery of vision. She nodded in spite of herself. "You don't mind flying, then, do you? Doesn't frighten you?" She shook her head, feeling ridiculous. "Never mind, then," the ghost said. "I'll look out for you. Heathrow in 3 minutes. Someone meeting you off the plane." "My father's business associate," she said in Japanese. The ghost grinned. "Then you'll be in good hands, I'm sure." He winked. "Wouldn't think I'm a linguist to look at me, would you?" Kumiko closed her eyes, and the ghost began to whisper to her, something about the archaeology of Heathrow, about the Neolithic and the Iron Ages, pottery and tools. "Miss Yanaka, Kumiko Yanaka." The Englishman towered above her, his gaijin bulk draped in elephantine folds of dark wool. Small dark eyes regarded her blandly through steel-rimmed glasses. His nose seemed to have been crushed nearly flat and never reset. His hair, what there was of it, had been shaven back to a gray stubble, and his black knit gloves were frayed and fingerless. "My name, you see," he said, as though this would immediately reassure her, "is Petal." Petal called the city Smoke. Kumiko shivered on chill red leather. Through the ancient Jaguar's window, she watched the snow spinning down to melt on the road Petal called M4. The late afternoon sky was colorless. He drove silently, efficiently, his lips pursed as though he were about to whistle. The traffic, to Tokyo eyes, was absurdly light. They accelerated past an unmanned Eurotrans freight vehicle, its blunt prow studded with sensors and banks of headlights. In spite of the Jaguar's speed, Kumiko felt as if somehow she were standing still. London's particles began to accrete around her, walls of wet brick, arches of concrete, black-painted ironwork standing up in spears. As she watched, the city began to define itself. Off the M4, while the Jaguar waited at intersections, she could glimpse faces through the snow, flushed gaijin faces above dark clothing, chins tucked down into scarves, women's boot heels ticking through silver puddles. It was nothing like Tokyo, where the past, all that remained of it, was nurtured with a nervous care. History there had become a quantity, a rare thing, parceled out by government and preserved by law and corporate funding. Here it seemed the very fabric of things, as if the city were a single growth of stone and brick. Uncounted strata of message and meaning, age upon age, generated over the centuries to the dictates of some now all but unreadable DNA of commerce and empire. Regret Swain couldn't come out to meet you himself, the man called Petal said. Kumiko had less trouble with his accent than with his manner of structuring sentences. She initially mistook the apology for a command. She considered accessing the ghost, then rejected the idea. Swain, she ventured. Mr. Swain is my host. Petal's eyes found her in the mirror. Tony Swain. Your father didn't tell you? No. Ah, he nodded. Man of his stature, etc. He sighed loudly. Sorry about the heater. Garage was supposed to take care of that. Are you one of Mr. Swain's secretaries? Addressing the stubbled rolls of flesh above the collar of the thick, dark coat. His secretary. He seemed to consider the matter. No, he ventured finally. I'm not that. He swung them through a roundabout, past gleaming metallic awnings and the evening surge of pedestrians. Have you eaten, then? Did they feed you on the flight? I wasn't hungry, conscious of her mother's mask. Well, Swain will have something for you. Eats a lot of Jap food, Swain. He made a strange little ticking sound with his tongue. He glanced back at her. She looked past him, seeing the kiss of snowflakes, the obliterating sweep of the wipers. Okay. That's it.
It sounds very good. When will it be released?
I don't know. I think in early next year. Because it's not done. That's the first time I've tried to read any of it out loud. That's always quite an experience.
Oh, you did very well. It sounds very, very good.
Well, it's a different kind of... It's a sequel to the other two in a way, but it's written... Two-thirds of it are written in a totally different kind of English from what I was doing before. I got tired of all these people writing about my debt to Raymond Chandler. I've never liked Raymond Chandler anyway. I've hardly even read. I have all of my Raymond Chandler by osmosis.
Okay, well, I think I'll scratch that question off right now.
Well, I don't mind talking about not having a debt to Raymond Chandler. But...
I was wondering about your writing career. When did it begin?
Around 77 was when I first tried to write anything at all. And I did, the first thing I tried to write, I sold to was a very, very short story that I sold to this obscure little science fiction magazine called Unearthed, which nobody ever saw. And since nothing happened, nobody ever saw it, and I got like $26.95 or something for the thing. I sort of gave up on it, and then I met Shirley at a convention up here, just by accident, and he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Oh, I'm a writer." And he said, "Well, what have you written?" And I said, "Well, I'm working on some stuff." So I sort of got trapped into it by meeting Shirley.
So your career is then by default, you're saying?
Yeah, it is more or less. So because I didn't have any sort of career, I was sort of past the age where one gets one, usually. Or at least the first one. I hadn't really done anything in particular before except, hang out around universities and take occasional courses. So it's sort of all Shirley's fault.
Okay, I'll remember to blame him in the broadcast. Just joking, of course. About what age were you when you in 77? Around 25?
God, I have a bad head for that. I'm 39 now, so we'll have to work it back. Let me see. It's 70. It's like 10 years ago. So those were like 29 or 28, 29.
Did this start when you were more mature? Do you think it added something to your fiction that is perhaps lacking in it? Yeah,
definitely. I think so. I mean, I don't know. I know that some people start, especially in science fiction, people can do very good work when they're very young. But I think if I had started when I was younger, I definitely wouldn't have had the stuff to draw on emotionally for the books. And a lot of my early stuff hits a kind of a very strange tone of affect that it can't sustain. But I see the same thing. Well, not to compare myself to Graham Greene, but I've noticed the same thing in Graham Greene's early novels. That these people, there's all this strange emotional stuff happening that doesn't seem to have too much to do with the situation that's being described. but he hits a similar sort of tone, at least when he first started out.
So Graham Greene, what are the other literary antecedents? The ones that you consider that have the greatest influence on you?
Oh, it's hard to know. As I get older, people have said that Chandler is a very obvious one, but I've sort of never liked Chandler much or read Chandler much, but I always liked Dashiell Hammett a lot. And I don't. If you hadn't had Hammett, you would never have had any Chandler. I think of Chandler as the guy who sort of took Hammett's very strange initial move into mystery writing and made it palatable for the mass market, or considerably more palatable. I think Chandler sort of watered Hammett down and got very rich doing it.
You do have a point there. You don't see the type of raw-edged violence that, say, Hammett has in Chandler's works.
Yeah, well, they're very interesting cases, those two guys, because I've always had a strong feeling that Chandler was a very, very puritanical writer, and the Chandler hero is a kind of guy from another period, like a more chivalrous period, who's really appalled and sort of perpetually shocked and appalled and horrified at the the sort of cruelty and viciousness of humanity which he encounters in his work, whereas the Hammett detective is as vicious or more so than the people he comes up against. It's just as twisted, and that's a very different kind of book. Hammett is much more profoundly black in his views, and much more than I am, for that matter. But I think that may have something to do with why Hammett never went on to write more. I think he sort of got it all out and didn't have much to say. And whereas a writer like Chandler can string it out for a long, long time.
What type of science fiction antecedents have you had, if any?
Well, I read a lot of science fiction when I was a teenager, but not a lot of it stuck. And when I started writing, the people I was consciously the people who were sort of at the forefront for me were more people like Hunter Thompson or Tom Wolfe. And I saw them as doing something that was more germane to what I thought science fiction could be than almost anything in science fiction was. There are writers still, genre writers I respect a lot. Fritz Leiber, particularly, I think is very underrated.
I would agree with you on that.
Yeah, he's a terrific writer, and he's done very, very strange, complicated things, often like 20 years ahead of their time in science fiction. And I don't think he's had the acknowledgement he deserves. Bester too. Bester's early work, I think, is like kind of still fresh and still very interesting.
Fritz Leiber's fantasy has overtones of what people might call a cyberpunk sensibility. Is City of Lankmar and Fafhrd and Ausser.
Yeah, I love those. I still like those very much. Fritz Leiber was taken to task by Ursula Le Guin in an essay about how to write fantasy, specifically for doing that. And she was pointing out all these things, like he has people smoking cigars in these stories. It's just these little throwaway details that, to her mind, violate the whole aesthetic. But for me, that's what makes those stories really nice. Is that funny kind of crossover feeling.
The fundamental tenets of cyberpunk, then. You said it earlier, before we were recording, that you almost doubt that there's even a movement in some ways.
Well, I wouldn't have called it. They asked after one of Dave Davies from the Kinks, I saw him quoted recently as having said something like, I didn't call it heavy metal when I invented it. And I sort of feel, I didn't call it cyberpunk either. I mean, that's the label came afterwards. And this sort of capital M movement thing came even after that. And it just, I don't know, it has the wrong, I'm older than most of my colleagues in this, a little bit older. Calling anything the movement with a capital M kind of gets my back up a little bit. Sounds like the SLA or something. I think it implies to me a kind of organizational level that I can assure you does not exist. It's not like there's cells of these guys out plotting to change science fiction.
But you do consider there's or at least you think there might be a stylistic element shared by you and the others?
Really what it is, I think it's mainly a matter of it's cultural. And I was like very lost socially. Like there wasn't too much happening for me in the world of science fiction, of like fans and science fiction writers and stuff, until I ran into Shirley and Sterling. And so we had all these things that we could talk about that we couldn't talk about with any other science fiction writers. We could talk about the music. We could talk about the music we liked, and all sorts of subcultural trends in North America and the world. And I think that's what it came from, a kind of cultural solidarity more than anything else. It was like it had this. It was sort of reminiscent of the feeling of it's us against the straights, which is a great feeling to be able to have after all those years. So, if it was like us and the uncles.
Perhaps we could delve right into the heart of the matter for me. Your fully realized future. How exactly did you obtain this fully crystallized universe of Neuromancer and Count Zero?
I'll be perfectly honest. It's not a fully crystalline. It's not a. What it is it's about one molecule thick and miles wide. But if you try to get into it at the kind of old-fashioned extrapolative nuts and bolts level of science fiction, it makes no sense at all, which is why a lot of the established science fiction writers have said, oh, come on, what's the fuss about? This is just, these guys aren't even doing science fiction. And sometimes that is true of me. I think Sterling is always doing science fiction. And Bruce's work does work at that level, which is remarkable. But I've never been as interested in creating a world that's what the Dungeons and Dragons guys call gameable. I'm not interested in that. Like these people come up to me and say, well, where do the people in this sprawl get their food? What's happening in the middle of North America? And I say, nothing. It's like there's nothing there. It's just, I've never even bothered to think about it. And my idea of a fully realized science fictional world would be one in which you could look at the data and deduce a sort of working model of a world. And with my stuff, you really can't do that. It's never been a concern of mine. I've rather tried for something that feels like a world. And I think I've pretty well succeeded in doing that, to judge by people's response. But my techniques for doing that are radically different from what I imagine traditional science fiction writers have tried to do.
I've noticed a particular strength of the Pacific Rim in your stories. The Japanese are coming on real strong, and you once mentioned the Chinese, I believe, in Neuromancer.
Yeah, maybe. I think that's just sort of in the wind. Living in Vancouver, everybody in the street knows exactly what you mean when you say the Pacific Rim, and there are all sorts of, there's like Pacific Rim National Bank and stuff. I mean, there's all sorts of Japanese business here, and stuff from Hong Kong and stuff from mainland China. And I think it just maybe helped that I was living here when I was writing that stuff, because I'm very conscious of it. I see, Japanese people in the street all the time, businessmen going by in cars, and there's this sort of buzz of industry, and the business people here are very aware of that as being a market, people they have to do business with. So that's kind of real for me. It's happening. It's not. I don't do very much predictive stuff. I just take things that I think are happening, transfer them into what we'll call for convenience the future, and then the reader accepts them somehow. I think more easily than the same reader would accept a serious lecture on the importance of the Pacific Rim economy.
Interestingly enough, it's penetrated even into Kansas. Our governor, our former governor, I should say, often took trips to China to encourage business ties between the United States and China.
Oh, it's very sound. I think it's a very, very sound policy. I keep noticing more and more mass market items that come into my life every day turn out to be made in China, like the Muppet Babies dolls from McDonald's are made in China, and the Levi's chinos I bought last week are made in China, and they're very well made. You know, I quite like that. I think that's a very good sign.
Well, I figure 1 billion Chinese, once they become aware of their economic strength, will probably become a dominant force in the world in the near future.
Yeah, especially after they get all those Muppet Babies and Levi's. I also love, I love to think of that kind of cultural symbolism of that too. It's really fascinating. These people are going to get to see everything. We had a very interesting thing here a couple of weeks ago along those lines, is that when the that America series was running, the controversial one was running, the local cable station here in protest donated 12 hours a day of free live Russian television, Soviet television, with no translation, just occasionally a voiceover that would come on and say, they're talking about astrology, and then you wouldn't hear any more English. And I actually got to see that, and that was a profoundly moving and strange experience. It's just all a bunch of people doing television, and it didn't look like Russia. I mean, it's like, I thought, well, who have I been thinking about all these years? What are these folks up to? I wish we could see that stuff all the time. I wish they could see ours.
You think then the expansion of the telecommunications network over the globe will then kind of break down nationalistic tendencies among different people?
I would hope so. I don't know what it's going to do. I mean, one of the failing of, science fiction's ongoing failing, really. I guess you can't blame us, but it's that we can predict television, but we can't tell you what television's going to do. And I don't think people don't know what television's done already. I was in Mexico a couple of years ago going by this terrible broken-down little village out in the middle of Jalisco somewhere, and sitting up on top of the tallest structure, which was only about 5 feet tall, was this huge satellite dish. And I asked the guy who was driving me through what that dish was for, and he said, well, if one guy got the money for the dish, and then he would rent a television to somebody else, and they could watch stuff off the dish. And I said, well, what can they watch? And he said, they can watch anything they can pick up. And I thought, what's that going to do to these guys sitting down there in that village who, 4 years ago, the closest thing they could get to that would be seeing some kind of, beat-up print of an American movie or something shown off the back of a trailer. And here they're over there watching Russian television and our TV and anything else they can get. And seeing that whole world without translation. I mean, I think that's kind of an awesome concept.
A few years ago, I saw a public TV documentary on a small American protectorate out in the Pacific. It showed these people that were dressed in the traditional manner, but they were watching American television. They had TV sets and satellite dishes, just like you said. It was totally non sequitur. It's just, these people, you'd expect them to be paddling through the blue waters of the Pacific, and instead they're sitting down watching Gilligan's Island.
Yeah, right. Well, it does make you wonder. I don't know whether seeing it on television makes it more real for us or less real. For some reason, as I grow older, I've become more superstitious about television. I think it's a profoundly powerful force, but I don't know what for.
I think Harlan Ellison called it the great mind suck machine.
I don't know. It's sort of been. I see. The cyberspace in my books is really just television. I mean, more than computers. It's sort of like watching widescreen TV with Walkman earphones, and the sound turned up really loud. I think you do get sucked into it, and it sometimes feels to me like another universe anyway.
Computer technology and television seem to be converging anyway. You remember the gentleman that hijacked a cable TV satellite
Yeah.
a while back.
Yeah. Well, the weirdest stuff the most accessible, strange technology for me is the sort of video post-production technology, which most people are familiar with mainly through seeing the super flashy little animated things that you get before news shows. You know, with whirling letters covered with mirrored faces reflecting whirling balls, and that kind of computerized graphics, and I know a little bit about how they actually do that because I read a magazine called Post, which is for post-production people, and it's amazing stuff. Like, they're getting very, very close. They're already very, very close to sort of real Max Headroom stuff, where you'd have completely computer-generated characters, except they wouldn't be all lumpy-headed. They would look just like people.
Yeah, fool that I was, I actually thought Max Headroom was a computer-generated image until someone straightened me out.
Yeah, I did too for the first time I saw it. But the people, I met some people in London when I first saw Max Headroom a couple of years ago who had worked with the people who did it. And they sort of straightened me up after 5 minutes. I was saying, that's incredible. And he said, yeah, but we have to lump all this modeling clay on him. But now it's like, right, they can really do it now, or they can come awfully close. And that really fascinates me. I think that's going to change the way we look at things. The way that the digital manipulation of photographic information has really made photographic information entirely unreliable as legal evidence.
In a science magazine a few months ago, they illustrated this fact by using I forgot what it's called, a something digitizer. And they took images from Princess Di's wedding and added an extra guardsman, added some straps to his uniform, just totally went crazy with the image.
Well, the thing that's sort of ominous still, or maybe wonderful philosophically about that, is that you're cutting so close with the technology that there is no other technology with which to go to the image and prove its alteration. That's what's strange about it, is you're down to the nitty-gritty of what's true and what's not. Because if you don't have evidence that the guardsman wasn't there and you don't have the other photographs, there's no way you can prove that the image has been altered. If that's the sole image. The same thing can be done with audio now, too. To the same sort of ultimate extent. That someone can produce a totally fraudulent tape of a conversation. I expect that will be proven legally fairly soon, because I've talked to some of the people who developed the programs, which are actually for editing music, which would allow you to do that. A court would have to just take somebody's word for the validity of a piece of tape.
This foreshadows doom for businesses teleconferencing their corporate discussions. And a very enterprising con man could gain access to this state-of-the-art technology and have a field day.
Yeah, I think I've always had this idea that people might have answering machines programmed to their voice prints that would actually answer the machine and say, "Hi, this is Bob's machine." Only it would sound just like Bob, but it would respond like Bob to a certain point. So it wouldn't even have to be people invading the teleconference. It could be machines coming on, passing the Turing test right there, and proving their supposed humanity.
What's really spooky about this, a few years ago, a bunch of psychologists got together and ran an experiment where they set up in separate rooms computer terminals. And on one terminal, they'd have a human typing from the other end, and on the other terminal, they'd have the computer responding.
Yeah.
And people couldn't tell the difference.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, we're very close to that sort of thing.
You discuss quite a bit in your novels the criminal underground, you might say, of the future, except that the characters don't come through as stereotypical criminals, of course.
Well, no, and that's I think I'm guilty of romanticizing that slightly. I mean, of course, like, real gangsters are about as appealing as a lap full of guts, but I don't know. I'm not even sure why I do that. It's sort of I think it's along the lines of what someone like Springsteen does in his lyrics, where you can, he's singing, he's writing these very popular songs about what turn out to be fairly desperate characters if you listen to the lyrics. But it's part of our culture, people identify with that, and they identify with little guys somehow surviving in the crevices of this world of huge corporations. And I didn't do that as a kind of cold-blooded thing to get people to identify with my characters. It just came quite naturally. I think it's kind of a cultural riff, particularly in America. Kind of a Jesse James thing.
I was just going to say that Bonnie and Clyde, Jesse and James, that America has a seeming fascination with the rogue element in society.
Yeah, it's sort of there's a kind of untrue thing there, because we sort of see these guys as being benevolent figures in some ways, and these are benevolent folk crimes and stuff, and of course they weren't. But yeah, it is. It's just it's part of the culture, really.
Do you think your Canadian upbringing, your being a Canadian, has given you an extra insight into American culture?
Well, actually, I'm not a Canadian. See, I've been here for 10 or 12 years, but I'm from southwestern Virginia originally. So I have sort of both sides of it. Living in Canada is a little bit like living in a sort of alternate history of America. Everything it looks pretty much the same, but the underlying reality is quite different. And for instance, people they're not, in spite of this being like kind of mostly wilderness, they're like relatively few handguns drifting around, and lower homicide rates and things, which I've come to quite appreciate over the years. If you get done in here, you're liable to get stabbed, more liable to be stabbed or something. People don't get shot at quite as randomly.
It must be kind of nice around here, even in Wichita. I even had to take a small handgun away from one of my crazier friends one night at a bar.
Well, that becomes very surreal when you live in a country where that doesn't happen so much. And I grew up right in the middle of all that stuff, and was belonged to the NRA when I was 14 and everything. So I know I know the cultural arguments for having it, but it's really great when you don't have to live with it. It's really it's something I don't worry about too much, and sometimes when I'm down in the States I do worry about it, because I think, well, maybe somebody will flip out and shoot me, and it happens occasionally.
Well, even in the middle of the United States, in a relatively rural state like Kansas, we had a gentleman drive all the way from Los Angeles going to a exercise center and gun down a bunch of people. It's like lightning.
Yeah. Well, see, that kind of thing happens here too, and that's another side of television. Like, people know about it. Like, you can get a gun here, and you can go out and use it. But I think, generally speaking, people are sort of don't think of it. It's not the first thing they think of if they're going to go berserk. Maybe they go and burn the barn down instead or something. I mean, I have an kind of unpleasant hunch that kind of gun culture is going to tend to go global eventually. That there's so many of the things floating around that eventually they'll sort of dissipate over the planet, and everybody will have a problem with that. But
well, to paraphrase a friend of mine who is a Vietnam veteran, once I talked to him, I said, well, a lot of our guys, a lot of the grunts were real big, kind of husky, Marine types. He said, hey, don't matter anything. Big Tarl in the bush isn't even 5 foot tall, and he can cut you down.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Well, I was wondering if you might have any pet peeves you want to lay on us.
Oh, let me see. Well, I always do, but I never. Today I don't have any at the tip of my tongue. I'll probably remember 5 things that really irritate me after we're done. I think deadlines, publishers' deadlines. That's a bad one, but there's sort of no way to get around it.
Well, I thank you quite a bit for talking to me. Oh, I knew I had a couple more questions I wanted to ask you.
Okay, plenty of time.
Okay. The video connection and I'm going to edit all this down, so I probably won't appear at all in the final show. My questions.
Yeah.
The video connection in Count Zero. Not video. Voodoo.
Voodoo. Oh, well, that was just one of those mysterious lateral moves that I didn't understand myself when I introduced it, but then I really got to like it, and having sort of looking back on it now, I think what I was doing was looking for a sort of theological worldview that would click with this computer future I'd made up, and I think that just about does it. The more I read about the roots of voodoo, the more I can see that I think it really is sort of applicable to the cybernetic age. And although it's sort of too complex to get into, the new book, Mona Lisa Overdrive, attempts to rationalize that at some point. I'm just sort of grappling with it now. And somebody at some point is going to say, but why do these computer programs think they're the voodoo pantheon? And someone will say, well, it's like this. But, I'm still 100 pages from doing that.
Also, I was curious about some of the background of this future world. You mentioned a war with USSR and Neuromancer.
Yeah, well, that was kind of a lot of things in Neuromancer are there as sort of reaction to things that tended to have been taken for granted in American science fiction. Like, you have to remember that when I wrote Neuromancer, I didn't expect it to have any sort of popularity. I thought it would sink without a trace and totally infuriate and alienate the science fiction establishment. I'm kind of amazed that it did as well as it did, because a lot of things in the book were designed to almost satirically to bug the kind of more right-wing science fiction people who never really have risen to the bait. But the war with the USSR, which seems to sort of just be dismissed, like no people have forgotten about it. It's only 20 or 30 years later. Was my way of sort of saying I was bored with the apocalypse. I was bored with reading pastoral fiction set after a nuclear war, and I didn't, of course, realistic fiction set after a nuclear war would just be kind of a frozen book with blank pages, so you can't really write about it. So I just they had one, but the assumption from the book is that they had a tiny little one. It was generally conceived to be very, very stupid, and they started dismantling the whole thing, and by the time the dismantling was in effect, again to judge by the internal evidence in the book, because I don't know, by the time they had gotten the war machine taken apart a bit, nations and national governments had ceased to be very important, and the corporations had taken over because they want to make a profit. And there's no profit in nuclear wars. There's some profit to be made in traditional wars, but nuclear wars cost everybody. So I guess that's what a lot of this. My favorite parts of those books can only be read by inference, and that's one of them.
Another little inference: no horses.
Well, yeah, that's a funny one. I don't have anything against horses. That just popped up. The equine flu epidemic got them. That's all I know about it.
Okay. Well, I used to work with horses, so it came as a shock to me that you gave them the chop.
Well, I was writing this thing last night, and part of it's set in London, and I had these two these two English gangsters sitting around. I said they were talking about the results of the horse races, and about 2 paragraphs later, I said, "Oh!" But I had to go back and change it to the dog races because I'd forgotten that there weren't any horses. It's easy to get caught in these things. I'm not going to write any more books set in this particular universe because it's already too top heavy for me.
At a certain point, the detailing becomes a hindrance.
Yeah. So it becomes too much. Then you're playing the traditional game, and I don't know what I'm going to do next, but it's not going to be another one of these. So this one sort of, I wasn't satisfied really with the first 2, and I doubt if I'll be satisfied with this one. But in any case, I'm going to wrap it up and get on with something else.
Just out of curiosity, are Burning Chrome and Count Zero going to be released in paperback soon?
Well, Count Zero is already out, I think, in the States. At least it is on the East Coast.
Oh, okay.
And
takes a while for things to filter through here.
Yeah, well, Burning Chrome, I think, is scheduled for paperback in October.
I own the hardbacks. I was just asking for the audience's information. I'm sure that the hardbacks were a little scarce around here, but I found that almost everything that's released in paperback sooner or later makes it to Wichita.
Hardbacks don't even feel like releasing the book, you know. It's really an obscure market. Like, I never got into buying hardbacks myself. I'm always amazed when somebody, kind of embarrassed when somebody turns up with a $20 book they've just bought. But when the paperback comes out, it's like everybody's got it, and that's a good feeling. So, I really won't know what people think of Count Zero until it comes out in paperback. So I'm looking forward to that.
Well, do you have any final comments? We're recording this for air date April 18th, so do you have anything you'd like the audience to be aware of?
No, nothing special. It's nice being here. It's nice talking with you.
Okay.